Where is Garreg Mach Monastery? Well, it's here, in the heart of Fodlan, of course, but the design took inspiration from medieval Europe. If Garreg Mach were a real place, where would it have been located, and when would it have been constructed? It's a bit of a weird question, I know. As a brief explanation, I recently completed my MA in Medieval Studies at York, the former Viking capital in northern England. It was an unparalleled experience, and I cannot recommend it enough to anyone who has the means to seek out such an opportunity. While I focused on languages and poetry, a dash of Old Norse, and a deep dive into Latin, I was fascinated by the medieval architecture still standing, if in ruins, all over Yorkshire. Now that I'm back, I'm trying to expand my studies of the medieval world. I don't want to present myself as any kind of expert. A master's will show you just how much you don't know, shredding confidence more than inspiring it, but I am an enthusiast. Throughout my studies, there's been a two-way relationship between my academic interests and the games I've played to relax after a long day. Exploring the monastery made me want to study medieval architecture more, and studying medieval architecture has augmented my appreciation for the monastery. So my objective in this video essay is to capture that two-way edification. How can we use Garreg Mach to learn about architecture? And how can an architectural analysis help us learn about Garreg Mach? To that end, I will take you on something of a tour of the monastery grounds, pointing out noteworthy architectural elements, but I also want to play the role of a kind of scholar/detective, seeing if I can piece together a hypothetical origin of the monastery. Where and when might Garreg Mach have been constructed if it had been built in medieval Europe? Again, I'm no expert, this is my hypothesis. If any of you guys notice some detail I miss in the monastery, or if you have any suggestions of possible European parallels, I would be thrilled to read about them in the comments. With that said, let's get started. First, we need to lay out a timeline that we are working with, a very simplified timeline full of debatable years and terms that could comprise a whole video on their own, but here I'm just going to paint the broad strokes of European medieval monastic architecture with a couple developments of specific elements along the way. The 11th to 12th centuries mark an era of what's called Romanesque architecture, reaching its height between about 1075 and 1125 in France, but also in Italy, Britain, and German lands. You can think of Romanesque architecture as the medieval inheritance and reimagining of classical and Byzantine architecture. It includes rounded arches, massive walls, piers and columns, and barrel vaults with almost fortress-like large-scale edifices. All this said, medieval understanding of their classical inheritance and adoption of neighboring ideas was very fluid, not as well documented as academics would like, and constantly expanding. Whether it was due to the innovation of its masons, or the evolving desires of its patrons, or the interplay of what a mason and builder and bricklayer and all those involved in the craft could do and what the patron could imagine and want, the style evolved and became its own thing. Roman-like, but definitely not Roman, hence Romanesque, and this innovation led to loftier ideas and more unique innovations as all those involved pushed for bigger, higher, grander edifices, whether for political power or out of religious devotion or out of a drive to secure one's name and legacy, more often the patrons than the master masons. This pushing for the bigger and better led to the era of Gothic architecture, which is also extremely vaguely defined in both its time span and what counts as Gothic, but we are keeping it relatively simple here. The 12th century marked the beginning of Gothic architecture, which spread rapidly from France throughout Europe into the 16th-ish century, gradually evolving into Renaissance architecture with later Gothic revivals. It's also worth noting that many of these buildings were destroyed and rebuilt, or were renovated during and after the Middle Ages. Just look at this picture of Chester Cathedral, for example. The building as it stands today was constructed and reconstructed over 7 centuries, so in what year should we say it was built? Architectural style, such as Gothic and Romanesque, is a sum of the building's individual components as well as the time of its production, often divided into categories and subcategories, which I will only touch on here. For now, we will consider something Gothic if it falls within the 12th to 16th centuries and has any of its key features: pointed arches, rib vaults, flying buttresses, and stained glass windows decorated with elaborate tracery. So, the big eras I will plot on the timeline are Romanesque, 1000 to 1200, Gothic 1150 to 1500, and Renaissance 1450 to 1650. Note the overlap and very rough approximations of years, showing that these eras are not defined and that styles chronologically situated in one era could be early or late residue of preceding styles with traces of things to come. As a brief rundown of subdivisions, there are several different systems we could employ. For example, one-way British systems divide Gothic is into 3 parts: Early Gothic 1120 to 1200, High Gothic 1200 to 1280, and Late Gothic late 12th to 16th centuries. Early Gothic is evidenced by rib vaults instead of barrel vaults, as well as flying buttresses. For example, we have Saint-Denis in France, constructed between 1129 and 1200. High Gothic saw the merging of the triforium and the clerestory, allowing for longer stained glass windows, more light, and thus more ornate interior decoration, especially through tracery on the walls. Late Gothic saw increasingly elaborate design on tracery and rib vaulting, including purely decorative ribs like liarns. These could be further subdivided into the flamboyant Gothic style from the 15th to 16th centuries, especially in France and Spain, with intricate stone tracery inside and outside and S-shaped curves on windows, and perpendicular Gothic style, 1300 to 1500 England, with large windows, 4 centered arches, straight vertical and horizontal lines in tracery, flattened arches and roofs, crenellations, and liarn and fan vaulting. This is not the only way to divide Gothic architecture. The French use Primary Gothic 1120 to 1200, Classic Gothic 1200 to 1280, Rhéanin or Radiant Gothic 1240 to 1350, which also aligns with an English decorated Gothic style, and Flamboyant Gothic 1350 to 1500. Another metaphor I've seen personifies Gothic as experiencing its youth in the 12th century, maturity in the early 13th century, and old age and decay from about 1300 on. I hope this illustrates my previous qualifiers of this being simplified. It can get infinitely complicated. These are the broad strokes. Some specific developments may help us better pinpoint Garreg Mach's construction. First, the reconstruction of the choir of Saint-Denis, Paris, from about 1140 to 1144 brings together many of these Gothic aspects. If we see a combination of pointed arches, rib vaults, flying buttresses, and stained glass, Garreg Mach postdates the mid-12th century. France continues to dominate the architectural innovation scene for a while. In the 1180s, the designers of the Soissons Cathedral exploit the support provided by flying buttresses to include elongated clerestory windows, and Chartres follows in the 1190s. Circa 1200, the flatness of Chartres clerestory becomes less influential with a new design in Geneva, finer moldings as in Dore Abbey. Note the lack of capitals and bases, and the simple foliage, a reflection of the Cistercian monastic order's desire for simplicity. Germany grafted these features onto traditional structures, from the lighter type at Bonminster, Romanesque 1140 to 1250, adopting some Gothic elements, to the bulkier architecture of the Magdeburg Cathedral, construction starting in 1209, completion of the steeples in 1520. Circa 1210, masons at Reims Cathedral, France, perfected a new device, bar tracery. It was adopted in Germany from circa 1227 in the Church of Our Lady at Trier, and gradually reached England, tentatively at Lincoln circa 1230, and more so at Westminster about a decade later. Only in the late 1200s did tracery designs become independent of the French models. In the mid-13th century, French innovations, known as the Rhéanin or Radiant style, gained popularity. Wheel-like patterns defined the rose windows in naves and transepts, buttresses lost their bulk beneath coverings of tracery and canopy work, and silhouettes were broken by pinnacles and gables set over doors and windows pierced with tracery for extra fragility. The first major church in the new style was Amiens, and Sainte-Chapelle is among the most famous. The style spread out as seen circa 1300 in the then cathedral, now mosque, in Famagusta, Cyprus, and in the 1350s Prague Cathedral. After about 1300, no new elements or approaches to building design were introduced. This was not a lack of creativity, but a reflection of the medieval desire to stay in touch touch with the past and build off the familiar. The French hegemony broke with diverse regional stylizing in the late 1300s. For example, look how Milan Cathedral played with elevation in the 1390s, though note that construction went on for a good 6 centuries after that. Spain also played with elevation, and England and Germany explored a wide variety of vaults and tracery. It's also worth noting the absence of Islamic influence in architecture through these periods. Around the time of the Famagusta Cathedral, late 1200s, and through the 1300s, Cyprus was the bastion of Western Christianity and trade in the Eastern Mediterranean, but it was under serious threat from Muslim expansion, particularly when the Ottomans seized Constantinople in 1453. Venetian styles replaced French as a hegemonic motif for the region, and they abjured all references to Islam, with similar attitudes in southern Spain after the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella drove the Nasrid rulers out of Granada in 1492. Granada Cathedral was founded on the site of a destroyed mosque. Its early designs were Gothic, though the Spanish Renaissance style was supplanting the Gothic by the 1500s. And that gives us a rough timeline to work with. So now let's turn our attention to the architectural elements that comprise the Garreg Mach Monastery, and then we will use those elements to hypothesize where in the timeline it might have fallen. We begin our tour with the heart of any monastic ground, the cathedral. As we cross the bridge, the splendor of the west facade comes into view. Stairs ascend to its singular portal, its rounded Romanesque arch nestled under an ornamental four-centered Gothic arch. 2 turrets rise above at its sides, their conical pinnacles lightly speckled with crockets, and a simple steeple. These turrets stand on either side of crenellated battlements that likewise line the roof, embellished by Lombard bands that complement the blind colonnades and stained glass windows of the flanking towers. This portal is quite unique. What we have at the entry to the cathedral is a particular kind of gate, called a portcullis, something typical not of monasteries, but of medieval fortresses and castles, the kind you'd see at Edinburgh Castle or Monkbar Gate in York. The battlements are also a hallmark of fortresses and castles, and they cover what we would normally expect to be a rose window, though this west-facing window extends downward and is veiled by the battlements. That said, crenellations aren't unheard of on religious buildings, such as Bath Abbey. I also want to emphasize here that I am not saying Garreg Mach is built wrong for having atypical features, or that any part of it is inaccurate. I'm not a stickler for that sort of thing, and it doesn't feel constructive to say, here's the right way, or how it should have happened. Rather, I'll be keeping in mind the question, what do the monastery's features say about the purpose and history of the building? A question I plan to revisit in my concluding thoughts. Moving forward, the gate opens and you enter the narthex, an entrance area between the profane world and the sacred church. A decorated door opens reminiscent of the holy doors within the papal basilicas in Rome. The semicircular decoration over the square door is called a tympanum, and you'll see them a lot throughout Garreg Mach. This one is made of stained glass, which may not permit much light to enter from behind the facade, but I could see some colorful evening light trickling in. Inside we do have something over the tympanum which resembles a rose window. This looks to me like plate tracery. Plate and bar tracery are both Gothic innovations, plate tracery being the earlier form in which decorative shapes are cut from a flat, solid plate of stone. While tracery was typically used to support and decorate windows, it has also been used, as noted in the timeline, as a decorative element on walls and in blind arches. Note the lack of height of the clerestory windows. Light comes from candles interspersed throughout the monastery, as well as a tall semicircular stained glass window in the apse, which would provide ample light in the morning, and seemingly from the dome, giving light throughout the day. I find this dome interesting and wish we could see it more clearly. In-game, you can't make out much more than a few stained glass windows and the hint of more windows above. For some reason, I assumed the tapestry-like thing in the 2018 trailer 2018, geez, that was a long time ago. I assumed this was the dome, an almost Renaissance-like decoration of the cathedral ceiling, though we also see medieval decoration like that in the octagonal dome of the 14th century Florence Cathedral. But I don't know where I got that idea that the artwork was the dome's interior, and I find no evidence for that in the game. Here, the dome is just a source of light. This front section of the cathedral is called the nave, where the audience sits. The sides are lined with square piers without decorated bases or capitals, and gilded coats of arms as adornment. At the central crossing is the emblazoned crest of Ceros, the brand of the saint for whom the church is named. The crest basks in the light of the stained glass and the high dome. Past the central crossing, you have the sanctuary, where you would normally expect to find seats for the choir, but here in Garreg Mach they make us stand. A girl prays facing the apse, the eastern recess where the altar rests. A golden reliquary rests on the altar, perhaps storing some sort of relic of Ceros. I have to confess I'm not quite sure what I'm looking at here. This could be the cathedra, the holy seat that makes this a cathedral rather than an abbey or basilica, but it seems high given the relative size of people walking by. It could also just be a table with a drape, just part of the shrine, with a docile or retable behind it. Either way, this would be a place for worship as multiple characters express throughout the game. Although you can't see it here, the introductory scene shows 5 long stained glass windows over the altar. I would expect with windows this tall and in a room this large, flying buttresses outside, and while there are buttresses indicated in the cutscene and visible on other buildings, they aren't the Gothic innovation meant to support such high walls and heavy roofs, where we'd expect to get a kind of Notre Dame aesthetic behind the east windows. We instead find a wall of blind arches and a sort of fluid combination of buttress styles, kind of like those of King's College Chapel in Cambridge. The cathedral ceiling, however, is a classic hallmark of Gothic architecture, the rib vault, each bay between transverse ribs sustained by 4 diagonal ribs, as we'd see in many 12th and 13th century cathedrals. This cross-ribbed vault helps sustain the high and heavy ceiling, at least during construction. Each arch springs from a sort of secondary pier embedded in the first, creating what looks to be a unique kind of compound pier. And on either side of this arcade you have the aisles, which open to a northern and southern transept that lead out of the building and give the chapel a Latin cross shape. Despite the enormity and grandeur of the cathedral interior, it is only one floor devoid of any triforium or clerestory, where taller windows would fill the nave with light. Perhaps this accounts for the aforementioned lack of flying buttresses. Though tall, this cathedral does not reach the same towering heights as many European cathedrals on its own, and so it may not have required the same structural support that taller, thinner walls with stretching windows did require. On either side of the apse you have 2 chapels, relatively small places of prayer and worship. The southern chapel contains statues of the 4 saints, while the northern chapel is dedicated to the Saint Ceros herself in full battle regalia, armed with her sword and shield and winged headpiece. She stands as a defender over the door to the mausoleum, where the bones of the goddess and her children, the mother and siblings of Ceros, are kept. You'll also find these niches in the wall, which are also located along the nave. Such niches are common components which can be decorative or can house objects like statues, busts, urns, and vases. The nave is lined with statues of bishops, possibly figures of veneration or to commemorate church leaders, as statues in cathedrals often do. As one final minor note on the cathedral, I do want to refer to the well outside the chapel, one near a door to some room, possibly a sacristy. It's probably a minor insignificant detail. There is one near your personal residency too, but if I make a follow-up video that I'm toying with in my mind on the hagiography of 3 houses, I think this well could actually be subtly significant, just a dash of something intriguing there. After all, what's a monastery without its mysteries? While a monastery can be a single building, it is often a complex of buildings, including domestic quarters and various workplaces to house a community of monks, laypeople, students, or even the occasional hermit. There are usually oratories, places set aside for prayer and worship, as well as cloisters, courtyards, refectories or dining halls, dormitories, infirmaries, libraries, balnearies, and latrines, sometimes monastic or cathedral schools or scriptoria, and even outlining granges and places for farming, fishing, or livestock. Garreg Mach really embraces this communal feel, a combination of residency and religious/educational facility. While I won't go as in-depth into each location as I did with the cathedral, I at least want to touch on some interesting or noteworthy details. The reception hall is enormous, some 5 or 6 stories tall and lined with buttresses, towers with octagonal domes and spires, and rose windows that put the edifice on par with the cathedral. The west end even has comparatively admirable matching crenellation over arched corbels between two turrets, as if the reception hall was meant to parallel the cathedral. On the ground floor, we have a large hall, an underappreciated part of a building with incredible flexibility in medieval times, the center around which many communal spaces were built. It was in halls that tables, screens, and temporary structures could be arranged and rearranged according to the building's purpose, a purpose which could fluctuate or might shift from its original intent when the building was under construction. Storage, sales, sleeping, socializing, halls could accommodate it all. This current arrangement creates a largely communal setting, divided from higher levels by screens and illuminated by clerestory windows. At another point, the hall is rearranged and room is made for a grand ball. The roof is vaulted, sustained by a network of rafters with bosses suspended from the junction of hammer beams and hammer posts. Chandeliers add what I suspect is superfluous light, drowned out by large clerestory windows, their stained glass matching that of the tall windows in the cathedral, though it's worth noting that these are lancet windows, windows that are elongated with a point at the apex, while the cathedral's windows were semicircular. The columns between every two windows seem to depict a certain type of compound pier, which is called a pilier cantonné, a quartered, somewhat clover-shaped column associated with high Gothic architecture. Here we see, as we often do with buildings that have more windows and thus more light, more elaborate internal adornment in the sconces, tracery, and the molding and blind arches over the door. And those blind arches, they're OG arches. I didn't expect to see that. What a treat. They were common enough, but I haven't seen them in Garreg Mach until reviewing this footage. I bet these arches were decoration added at some later date. Anyway, leave the residence hall from the west end and you'll emerge under what are called groin vaults. No, I'm not making that up. They're a precursor to the cross-rib vaults. To the east, you leave under more Romanesque barrel vaults, though. This building thus strikes me as older than the cathedral. Go up a floor and you reach the audience chamber, another room with parallels to the cathedral. Saintly statues and pedestals bearing vases or urns lead the audience between vaulted aisles to the eastern apse, where the bishop's seat rests in the light of a unique, elaborate stained glass window under an equilateral arch. Similarly decorated lancet windows line the clerestory under another cross-ribbed vault, iconic Gothic architecture. Foliage decorates the bases and capitals, further adorning and emphasizing the significance of this room. Transepts here, too, give the audience chamber a Latin cross shape, as if this room is a chapel. The northern transept is decorated with small floral vases and banners with the crest of Ceros, and the desk and tall seat, along with two benches, indicate this room is a place for meetings, administrative matters, possibly secular in nature as well as religious. All this adornment, the foliage, statues, vases, crests, vaulting, and windows, could have religious as well as political significance, all bespeaking the authority of Archbishop Rea. Pass through the barrel-vaulted halls and you'll arrive at the library, a wide chamber illuminated by 3 lancet windows and a series of cross-vault bays. Timber structures have been added over a colonnade, a later addition to the stone edifice, which, as I noted in the reception hall, was not uncommon. Sometimes buildings were constructed with an express purpose in mind, but often purposes were imposed on spaces as needs arose, or plans would change as one master mason or patron took over after another in these sometimes centuries-long processes. This may not have always been a library, evidenced by the differences in material. The books contained herein include both the religious and secular, matters of church shelved alongside matters of politics, history, and geography. This would definitely be a library of the late Middle Ages. Early monastic libraries might contain only a handful of books. This was a time when each book had to be copied by hand. But with the development of the codex, trade across a wide geography exposing different people groups to a variety of materials and ideas, and religious fervor incentivizing the creation of increasingly elaborate texts, writing was far more prolific by the end of the Middle Ages. A collection of this size, supplemented by collections all over the monastery, would parallel, if not surpass, the largest collections in medieval Europe, these numbering in the thousands. I also find it noteworthy that reading was conducted in the areas that stored the books, which was not always the case. In medieval monasteries, reading was often conducted in the cloister. Some monasteries had a special room for writing called a scriptorium. Others had narrow spaces called carrels built into the walls where monks would sit and copy texts. Garreg Mach, meanwhile, uses such locations for more social purposes, blending the monastic atmosphere here with that of a more modern university concept. That said, the genres of texts are quite typical of medieval monasteries, whose collections included complete or individual works from the Bible, often with notes or commentaries in the margins, works by the church fathers, hagiography or saints' lives / holy writing, books of sermons, histories, classical texts, and treatises on medicine and agriculture. This may sound surprising to some, but it is in no small part thanks to religious monks and scribes that so much classical knowledge was preserved. What was received as wisdom versus what was critiqued as heresy depended on time, place, and text, but in general, classical ideas, from the mystical to the medicinal, influenced later religious traditions. Moving outside to the Officers' Academy, we find the more education-focused center of Garreg Mach, where the houses divide and train. The exterior is lined by a pointed arcade under more fortress-like crenellations. The wall is adorned with blind, blunt arches and crocket-decorated towers. Each house's classroom is ornamented with their banners on either side of a grand portal, its archivolts and tympanum decorated by foliage and the jambs. Ooh, well, this is something. These are fluted columns, a common component of Greek architecture revived in the Renaissance, but I don't know of it ever actually showing up in medieval architecture. The closest I could find were some unique channeling techniques in crypts like those of Canterbury Cathedral or Rolduc Abbey from the 12th century Netherlands. This is really cool. The windows are quite lavish. Those by the entrance are double lancets with a quatrefoil oculus pronounced by bar tracery and molding around the window. At the opposite end stretch 3 lancet windows with elaborate tracery and molding reminiscent of the Jesse window of York Minster. Between these and the arcade, creating a mini nave and aisles, the classrooms present themselves as condensed versions of the cathedral, as though these were chapels and education were a holy endeavor akin to worship. For the remaining locations, I only want to touch on a few details that stood out to me. Medieval dormitories were usually on the 2nd floor, with night stairs leading to the abbey for worship and day stairs leading to the cloister. These were often single long rooms with minimal lighting and no privacy. A circuiter would even patrol, ensuring no one spoke or lit candles. Only the Carthusians, a religious order emphasizing separation from the world, had isolated cells, so the students of Garreg Mach should consider their private quarters quite luxurious. The dining hall could also have been called a refectory, such as this one from 12th century Portugal. I find the 2 arcades, the blind arcade arches, the banners and chandeliers descending from bosses under transverse arches, and a somewhat purple ceiling to be all surprisingly ostentatious, personally. It gives the dining hall a regality, and it makes me wonder if this might also have been used for something of a ceremonial hall. I cannot find any evidence for modern-style saunas in medieval monasteries. The concept of saunas stretches back to the Neolithic age, so I mean they existed, and it's possible some of these structures were used for both bathing and a steamy relaxation. Sweat baths, hot rocks in small rooms, bread ovens, steam being funneled into another room. People have always found ways to create these little hellholes throughout history. Obviously, I'm no fan. So I'll just call this the balneary or the bathhouse or some kind of lararium for washing. Maybe even the latrines were nearby here, or maybe in these unenterable spaces in the Officers' Academy. Monasteries did have latrines separate from bathhouses, sometimes with whole piping and draining systems to control the flow of water, so I'm just going to call the sauna part of that whole side of things. I don't see any cloister on these monastery grounds. The training grounds, though, do appear somewhat comparable as a wide outdoor space encircled by arcades, but courtyards do abound as more serene open spaces. At first I thought this little canopy was just some lazy copy-paste of the groin vaults connecting the reception hall to the Officers' Academy, but these little canopies did actually exist. We can see them in the Ciboria in Milan and Croatia. Even the gazebo has a medieval precedent, which surprised me. Monasteries and abbeys did have quiet outdoor spaces for prayer and reflection. I can't help but notice other buildings and higher floors to which you do not have access. The building beyond the stables and the Knights Hall I suspect are more dormitories, but I wonder if any of these might house other locations common to monasteries but missing from Garreg Mach. An infirmary, perhaps, which would have been a very significant location of any medieval monastery. Or maybe one of these towers or sealed off spaces serve as something of a chapter house. Wherever monasteries held land, sometimes in nearby granges, sometimes quite distant, they would use it. Farming, sheep, cattle, horses, even fisheries and ironworking. This abbey barn in Somerset, England even has buttresses comparable to those at Garreg Mach. Self-sufficiency was a common component of monastic life, which would have included growing food and, at least by the 16th century, windmills to grind grain. The market bordering the monastery was also a nice touch. It was a norm to have the church building be a center of town life. The sacred and profane were often fused, as noted by the blending of religion and politics, and the economics of trade by grand cathedrals was no exception. But the church would establish itself as distinct through architectural symbolism, announcing its exalted position in society. One ritualistically ascends from the world of the profane, passing under decorated doors, through vaulted ceilings representing the canopy of heaven or the grandeur of a secular lord or both, and the deeper one ventures into sacred spaces, the grander and more glorious the display, communicating the reverent awe one should adopt as they leave behind the world. You are somewhere special. So, with our tour/investigation complete, let's revisit the question: when and where would Garreg Mach have been located had it been built in medieval Europe? I was surprised to find so much Romanesque architecture throughout the monastery. I'd have thought Garreg Mach would be Gothic, but taking time to really examine its details revealed a pretty heavy Romanesque foundation. The massive walls, the barrel vaults, the abundant round arches. But obviously Garreg Mach has a number of Gothic elements as well, from the pointed arches to the cross rib vaults, not to mention the long stained glass windows with bar tracery. We also need to take into account what we do not see. There's no triforium or clerestory in the cathedral. There are no flying buttresses, one of the most noticeable hallmarks of Gothic architecture. Further, the tracery, vaulting, and foliage all feel quite simple. These buildings do not have that rich, hyper-detailed adornment of your late Gothic/early Renaissance style, so I think we could exclude anything from roughly 1300 onward. Revisiting the specific markers on the timeline, we do see the combination of several Gothic aspects, the pointed arches and cross-rib vaults, so this building would likely post-date the reconstruction of Saint-Denis from 1140 to 1144, so I could give ourselves a time span of roughly 1145 to 1300 then, a century and a half, which is not bad. We do find some evidences of finer moldings in Garreg Mach, but they're incredibly simple as well, not too dissimilar in aesthetic from Dore Abbey, which reflects that Cistercian desire for simplicity. We even see comparisons in the buttresses and the crenellated tower. Interestingly, the Cistercian monastic order, founded in 1098 at Citeaux Abbey in France, was also among the first to adopt granges for land, livestock, and self-sufficiency, which inspired other orders to follow in kind. Citeaux Abbey's great church, constructed from about 1140 to 1193, even shares some parallels with Garreg Mach's architecture. Note the rounded arches, simple buttresses, lack of a tall clerestory, and simple bar tracery around the windows. But there are plenty of differences too. Perhaps Garreg Mach would have taken inspiration from the trends which also gave rise to Citeaux Abbey. The presence of bar tracery suggests a 1200s creation, and I'd say early to mid 1200s, as I don't see the elaborate detail work on buttresses, tracery, or pinnacles that marked the Rayonnant style. And this brings me to my conclusion. I suspect that Garreg Mach would have had an 1100s Romanesque foundation, but would have had Gothic innovations added to it sometime between 1210 and 1250. In fact, I might narrate even farther to an original construction in the 1100s, and then significant additions between 1230 and 1250, as it is 1230 when England adopted France's bar tracery. And I say England because of some edificial parallels I've been noticing while researching this video. From the 13th to the 15th century, England adopted what's called a University Gothic style. The edifices we've been examining form a part of a mini Renaissance in the 12th century, and this medieval rebirth included innovations in a number of fields: architecture, writing, and the development of universities, which took their architectural design from monasteries and manor houses. And here we start seeing some of the striking visual parallels between Garreg Mach, appropriately so, as Garreg Mach is both a religious and educational site, a monastery but also a university. For example, we have Merton College, a constituent of Oxford tracing back to the 1260s, and its quadrangle, which dates to the late 13th century. More striking striking to me is New College, another Oxford constituent, this one dating to the late 14th century. Its chapel and old city wall bear striking resemblance to Garreg Mach, with the buttresses, crenellations, and crocket-adorned towers. Its quadrangle with the crenellations and different arch styles combined a hall, library, chapel, and residencies. One more Oxford example, the early 15th century Balliol College. Note the crenellations, octagonal tower, and the fourth-centered arches over the windows and courtyard entry. I also note some parallels in King's College Chapel, Cambridge, with crockets on the octagonal domes and spires, the comparable buttresses, and the single decorated door under the tympanum, though now we're reaching the late 15th and early 16th centuries. Now, you might have noticed that I hypothesized an early 13th century construction, and then pointed to buildings constructed throughout the following 3 centuries. That is also another consideration we need to bear in mind. How long did it take to construct Garreg Mach? Another parallel closer to my hypothesized time might be Durham Cathedral. It was completed between 1093 and 1133 in the Romanesque style, but note the pointed arcade and equilateral arches over windows divided by bar tracery, all Gothic additions, made in the 13th century. The cathedral thus bears evidences from Romanesque, early Gothic, and even later perpendicular Gothic styles. If I had to guess, I'd say Garreg Mach would have had a comparable history, an original 11th century construction in the Romanesque style, perhaps not even originally intended to be a monastery, and then with later additions added in the Gothic style, adopting some but not all of its unique markers, with a Cistercian-like desire for simplicity in its decoration. I don't think it would have been a stretch to also hypothesize a heavily militarized past. Its saint is literally a warrior, and with the war-torn history of Fodlan, defenses were added or maintained along with the religious elements. Thus, we end up with a cathedral guarded by a portcullis, several of them, and armed guards defending statues of bishops and saints. Perhaps its construction shared a history not too dissimilar with that of the ruins of the 12th century Rievaulx Abbey in Yorkshire. The monastic precinct was surrounded by walls and gates, marking the transition of any who entered away from the secular world and into the sacred. Novices were sheltered deeper inside, both physically and spiritually, as they learned how to internalize that transition. And yet the monastery was a place of work, with land and fields and animals, where the river was altered to exploit water power for mills and other sustaining works. And while inner courts were exclusive and open only to servants and the most important to visitors, each location was placed according to the activities that took place there, including those that connected the monastic world to the outside world. Even as those who entered tried to achieve isolation, the two worlds were interconnected, and interconnectedness made starkly evident when the edifices were destroyed by Henry VIII in 1538 during the dissolution of the monasteries. How appropriate it is, then, that you get to see Garreg Mach both in its splendor and in its destruction. But so many monasteries were rebuilt with new, innovative styles after periods of destruction. One of the most influential monasteries, Chartres, was largely rebuilt after a fire in 1194, and it became a leading example of high Gothic architecture. This introduces some fun world-building questions. What will happen to Garreg Mach after the events of Three Houses? Will it be rebuilt? And if so, how will its reconstruction look? If it's an edifice meant to honor its patron and their wishes, the manner of its reconstruction would probably heavily depend on who claims it as a territory. So if you help the church reclaim what it lost, it will likely rebuild it as it once stood. But if you help the empire destroy the church, what will become of Garreg Mach? Will it retain its military aesthetic and purpose? Will it be rebuilt to commemorate other, perhaps more secular patrons? Or would it be left in ruins, thereby commemorating all else that was destroyed along with the monastery? We are left to wonder. If Garreg Mach had been constructed in medieval Europe, when and where would it have been built? I am proposing an original 11th century Romanesque structure in England, largely reconstructed between the 1230s and 1250s with French influence, and with later additions spanning centuries, but no major renovations beyond mild repurposing here and there. The library was likely the largest thing to evolve, accumulating a myriad of texts as the church amassed its collection and curated all it wanted its students to have access to in their education. But But what do you think? Did I leave anything out? Are there other observations you noticed that I didn't detect or comment on? I'd be thrilled to read any of your thoughts in the comment section. Also, let me know if you like this kind of analysis. It was fun for me, and it gave me something to keep in mind as I read up on medieval architecture. There are a couple other aspects of medieval life I'm debating bringing into another analysis essay of this kind. And if any of you are interested, I've posted a Drive link to my architecture notes in the description. I found a couple online glossaries that supplemented my research, which largely came down to Nicola Coldstream's medieval architecture and notes I took while studying at York, but none of the glossaries I was finding online quite had that combination of terminology and images and chronology, and so my notes were my attempt at organizing all that for myself, though my notes aren't nearly as complete or organized as I would like, but there's a loose structure to them and there are plenty of visual examples of architectural terms, so if this sounds at all interesting to you, feel free to look at or download my ad hoc handbook. And with that, thank you for your visit at Garreg Mach Monastery. Have a good one.